And in studying then Khenchen Palden Sherab's opening the wisdom door to the middle way, or opening the wisdom door of the Madhyamaka School, today we're going to look at the what's called Rangtong and Shentong schools, and also quite a bit about the two truths. I think it would be helpful. No, it would be helpful. It's essential. It's essential that you read. So if you're new to this material, then it will be daunting. Then again, some of you are familiar with the idea of the two truths, and if you read the book, it'll be a lot easier, obviously. Yeah. So here we go. I'm going to just cut this. So, by the way, can I just have somebody confirm that the sound and so forth is all right? Can you hear me? Yes, we're good? Oh, good. Thank you. Grazie. Excellent. All righty. All right. So and this is really actually not, even though it looks familiar and repetitive, it can't be overestimated the benefit of this, that we're studying this not as an isolated little practice for our own interest and so on, but really dedicating this to the benefit of all sentient beings. So we generate this intention, bodhicitta, to study this so that we will gain insight relatively and ultimately enlightenment. And what we're looking at has to do with, and this is so important, not obvious, this has to do with touching the base of what creates suffering everywhere. It's right at the heart of what we call first-person experience, or first-person subjectivity, all of that. That is what we're onto. So you couldn't think of a study that's more relevant, more immediate, and getting to the bottom of this, something that has greater benefit. You wouldn't find it. I challenge you. This lies at the very heart of everything positive. Yes, it doesn't mean that all of a sudden we don't do anything, but when we have that insight, then whatever we do has much greater impact. So this is very much about us generating the motivation to be there for all sentient beings, to never abandon any sentient beings. So we formulate this. I will study and integrate the middle way teaching to bring all sentient beings to perfect enlightenment. Once again, the context for what we're studying is the middle way as was taught by the Buddha and later formulated and clarified by Nagarjuna, whose teachings were then again clarified, formulated by Buddha Palita and Bhaviveka and Chandrakirti. And these teachings were brought to Tibet finally by Shantarakshita and Kamalashila. So these are the Indian gurus in the lineage, and specifically then we are studying the teachings from the two Khenpos here as it comes down from Great Master Rongzum Pandita and the Great Masters Longchen Rabjam and Jamgun Mibam. Now I'm just going to recap, and there has actually been questions about this, about the Prasangika and Svatantrika Madhyamaka. And these two are completely indispensable. The Prasangika, if you like, is the ground view, but the Svatantrika enables actually a way in which we can approach the subject matter. So they're both indispensable. But to quote Jamgun Mipam, he then says, therefore, one should know Prasangika and Svatantrika as they are manners of explanations emphasizing one, and this refers to the Prasangika, wisdom of meditative equipoise for which the two truths are one taste. And that means in the sublime being's meditative equipoise, there's not any concept, two truths, and so on. And that, of course, applies to the Prasangika as well as to the Svatantrika. But the thing is, mainly the Prasangika, they make a point of this indispensable understanding. And that becomes, you'd say, the highest view. The Svatantrika is then the manner of explanation that emphasizes two: supreme knowledge of post-meditation, for which the two truths are distinctly discerned. And see, the moment that we begin to talk about things, then we operate within post-meditation. And that's where the understanding of the two truths as separate is very helpful. So this understanding of the two truths is what we're going to look at specifically today, according to two truths according to the Svatantrika. But the Svatantrika, again, on the absolute level, yes, they have the same emphasis on the wisdom of the meditative equipoise. It's only within the context of post-meditation and relative truth that they then operate with this idea of the two truths. And this is quoting from this scripture that the Khenpo's referred to several times, which is Mipham Rinpoche's commentary on the adornment of the middle way, Shantarakshita's adornment of the middle way. But I took this translation from Douglas Duckworth in his work that's called Mipham on Buddha Nature, and I'd like to recommend that for anybody who's interested in what we're discussing here. Probably this is, well, I found this possibly one of the most, or definitely one of the most helpful books in understanding, you say, the Nyingma view and the middle way and so on. And let me just say one thing. This is more general. This is more coming from myself. But this is something I think we need to recognize also in terms of understanding the value of what we're doing. And that we should. We might call ourselves Buddhists, and most of your friends will think that you're then religious. But actually, you are not more religious than you are actually embracing a path that encourages critical thinking. And as such, what we are operating with here is a science. Now, the thing is, where general science operates with, you could say, observable matter, we are operating within a science that appreciates the laws that govern the subjective dimension. And so this we sometimes in Western philosophy refer to as phenomenology. But this is not just ordinary phenomenology, as you could say, in the ways that we map and identify and understand the human condition. Here we're talking about a greater phenomenology, which is the phenomenology of awakening. We talk about confusion, samsara, but we also talk about the phenomenology of nirvana, of awakening. And so the point that the reason we do this is not because we're doing philosophy, because we want to get to the bottom of what causes suffering. And so, well, our goal with this is enlightenment. And so this expanded phenomenology of awakening, apologize the Greek in here, but anyway, this is about a quality in ourselves that is not just data and information. And so it goes beyond the ordinary classifications of rationality. And it is about achieving enlightenment. Now, for us to then journey on the path, it actually takes more than just the rational element. Madhyamaka is great for rationality, but it actually ultimately, and here I quote Tsongsa Khenchen Rinpoche, who once said to me, the greatest purpose of logic is that it provides a foundation for faith, because faith takes us into a place of trust, openness, and ultimately this is the foundation for this expanded phenomenology of awakening. This is the foundation for the qualities of the path that cannot be defined in terms of just language. Now, in doing that, Madhyamaka has a role, and this is the whole idea of refutation, that there's a lot of critique in Madhyamaka, and it's very helpful critique. It's about getting to the bottom of some of the things that we assume, and actually we are mistaken in our assumptions. So this is where Madhyamaka then is about exposing some of the flawed ideas that govern us. Today's discussion then begins with the Rangtong and the Shentong. And Rangtong means intrinsic or empty in itself, and Shentong means extrinsic emptiness or empty of something else. So this is part of the Prasangika Madhyamaka, and we just want to make a point about that, because anytime you're going to be, if you ever hang out with people who are, thinking about these things and particularly studying then the Madhyamaka teachings, there's particularly in the Tibetan context, there is these terms, Rangtong and Shentong. They're quite, they're about as common to the Madhyamaka discussion as what Republicans and Democrats are in discussing politics in the US. Anyway, the Prasangika Madhyamaka points to the freedom from conceptual concepts altogether. It's the highest view. But when we do that, when we say that freedom from conceptual constructs, emptiness, right? Is there something left or not? Well, there's two approaches to this. And this is where the Rangtong, sorry, I should really have translated this here, but let's say it's empty in itself. That asserts that all of phenomena and nirvana is empty. It's all an illusion, samsara as well as nirvana. Shentong, those who say it's empty of something else, means they say that all of samsara is empty, it's illusion, but nirvana is real. They would say the qualities of nirvana, they are truly existing. So that's an important point then in understanding, because there are schools, like for example, there's some famous schools that really insisted on generally everybody's Rangtong. And the positions that we have, Rangtong and Shentong, if you want, the Rangtong view is very much associated with the Gelug and Sakya traditions, the Shentong more associated with the Nyingma Kajus, and particularly Shentong is associated with the tradition of the Kala Chakra, what's known as the Jonangpas. But all of that is not so hard and fast, and we can thank and praise Jamgun Miparimajay, because he said ultimately all of these classifications point to something that is inconceivable. So as far as Jamgun Mipam's position on this is ultimately that he's actually Rangtong, in that all of, you could say, there's nothing we can grasp about nirvana, but then again it does manifest, and ultimately we're talking about something that is inconceivable. So that's an important point. But anyway, within Madhyamaka context, you do have these terms Rangtong and Shentong. So when we talk about the Rangtong, then we could generally say that the Rangtong view is a non-affirmative negation. When we say non-affirmative, we mean it doesn't affirm anything. There's nothing left. There's no. So it's just like if we would say the Brahmin doesn't drink, all right? When you think of that, a Brahmin doesn't drink, that if you say a non-affirmative negation, that actually means he never drinks anything. Now the Shentong view is what we call an affirmative negation. It means that yes, it's a negation, but there is something that's still going on. So we say the Brahmin doesn't drink beer, but then again, he might drink lassi. So in that sense, the Shentong leaves something, once you've cleared away the illusion, or rather, once you've cleared away one thing, there's still something left. Okay, Rangtong and Shentong. Rangtong view is that Buddha nature is empty. And this is also what the Khenpos then explain. And Shentong view is that Buddha nature is, yes, it's empty of delusion, but it's also replete, complete, and has all the infinite qualities of enlightenment, spontaneously present. So that's where the Buddha nature teachings, they, for example, would say that from this point of view, the Buddha nature has all the qualities, just like a Buddha statue that's still sitting in a mold. We can't see it in the mold, but within the mold, it's sitting there, perfect, with all the qualities. So that view is very much what we also employ in the Vajrayana context, that all the qualities are there. We just overlook them. So specifically now, we're going to look at the Svatantrika Madhyamaka, and specifically around Shantarakshita. Now, the Khenpos, they talk a lot about the history, and then so just to go over that briefly, The Svatantrika Madhyamaka, or also sometimes referred to as the Yogacarya Madhyamaka, this school of Shantrakshita that we are studying here, comes to us through the Khenpos very much, them basing themselves on the omniscient Longchenpa, Khenchen means omniscient, and also Jamgun Mipam, these two great masters. And in this school then, the Shantrakshita's Svatantrika Madhyamaka, the ultimate view, free from conceptual concepts, no reference points whatsoever, no objectification, that which is indescribable, great emptiness, that is the same as the Prasangika. Now the relative truth, as we started off in our first session, yes, that's seen as the Yogacarya school sees it, display of the mind. So ultimately, mind also is something that is without anything we can objectify about it. But what manifests? Yes, that is the display of the mind. So relative truth is then understood as mind. It doesn't mean the Prasangikas actually don't agree with that. They agree with that. They just don't want to talk about it. They don't want to make any assertions. If you read Tsongtse Khyentse Rinpoche's teachings on Madhyamaka, he repeats this again and again, that we're fine with Yogacharyas as long as we don't make any assertions about some absolute quality of the mind. So as far as understanding phenomena, Prasangi Madhyamaka actually, they agree with the Yogacharya. It's just that in the Svatantrika Madhyamaka, they just make more of a point, whereas the Prasangikas, they just want to say, oh, we don't assert anything, period. Now, it's very important when we are, and if you're new to this study, you might think, gosh, there's a lot of squabbling going on about something called emptiness. But in fact, these are really just about what do you emphasize in your pedagogy? What do you emphasize in terms of explaining to others? And that's where it's about. It's not that anybody really thinks that enlightenment is all about words. And so all these paths, they are ultimately leading to enlightenment. And it's really just a discussion of some of the subtle points in terms of explanation. Now we have this discussion about Shantrakshita, and you might be well, if you've been around Buddhism, then you might be familiar with it. We do have some very long-lived persons, sages. Actually, Jigme Khyentse Rinpoche's father, Khyentse Rinpoche, he supposedly went and received a reading transmission from somebody who had been a direct student of Yeshe Tsogyal. Who lived with deer and basically just lived as a deer, a siddha, Mahasiddha, but in Tibet. So, Yeshe Tsogyal lived quite a while ago. We have people like that, and amongst them also then Shantrakshita. And it's said that Shantrakshita, like the Khenpos explained, he came to Tibet, established Buddhism, but because of former vows made in previous times, then he waited for Padmasambhava. And so Shantrakshita became very old before Padmasambhava showed up. But it talks about and this is basic for Tibetan Buddhism, that the persons that were involved in the establishment of Buddhism, establishing Buddhism in Tibet, they took different roles based on aspirations they had made far, far back in time, in a previous era, when these four sons, and we see them here, under the direction of their mother, Sambara, built the Bodhnath Stupa. And you see here an old picture actually taken it's about 150 years ago, of the Bodhnath Stupa. It would look pretty much the same nowadays. When they built this in a previous era, in a previous eon or whatever, ages ago, then upon completion of this stupa, then they made these vows. So there's a number of characters in there who then later reincarnated in Tibet. And these are the four sons. Upon completion, she had passed away. Actually, if you go to the Bodhnath Stupa, there's actually a temple that's dedicated to her at the stupa. But the four sons, they vowed to be reborn in Tibet and establish the Buddhist teaching there. And these are then 4 sons. The son of the stable hand made aspiration and was born as the king Trisondetsen. The swineherd son reborn as Shantrakshita. The dogkeeper son born as Padmasambhava. And then the son of the poultryman says as a minister who was key, and that can only be Nyangwen Tinsen Sampo. He's not mentioned by name, but at the time of King Trisondetsen, there was sort of a Richelieu, a grey eminence, and somebody who just orchestrated everything brilliantly. For the King Trisondetsen was very young when he ascended to the throne, and Nyangwen was not just a great politician, but also supposedly the first Tibetan, certainly Buddhist, that attained a rainbow body. And so across from the Potala, there's a cave where he actually attained rainbow body. He was a great meditator, but he was also a great minister and was very helpful to the whole process. So that's a bit of history, and this is really just to discuss the greatness of Shantrakshita. What's also special about Shantrakshita is, of course, he was like I always say, he was a giant in Indian Buddhism, and he was that because he joined the Yogacarya and Madhyamaka view, and this approach is spread throughout all of the Central Asian Buddhist countries. So you had lineage holders like his direct student Kamala Shila, also somebody called Acharya Haribhadra, Dharma Mitra, Arya Vimukta Sena, Abhaya Gupta, and, which is not mentioned here, a great master and teacher called Ratnakara Shanti. So these students of Shantrakshita, then they went on to uphold the Buddhist, spread the Buddhist teaching widely, also beyond Tibetan India. Then the Khenpos then mention Longchen and Jamgun Mipam, just in terms of the history here. And it's interesting, well, let's just to say, yes, Longchen, he is famous for having articulated then the pith of both the sutra and mantra teachings, all the Buddhist teachings. And so we have in the some of the teachings like the what's it called, the treasury of scriptural doctrine, the treasury of basic space, and so on and so forth. Teachings that sum up all the teachings of the Buddha, but then specifically Longchen, he articulated and gathered all the existing instructions on Dzogchen, Mahasandhi, the Great Perfection. And so he wrote 2 big opuses, which one is the 7 treasures, but also what is known as the 7 branches of the heart essence teaching. Jamgun Mipam is very important and for us, because nowadays you could say all the Nyingma views really are formulated through Mipam, his writings. He was 19th century, and he did so actually at the request of Jamyang Khyentse Wangpo. He said, Jamyang Khyentse Wangpo said to him, please write down and formulate the view of our tradition, the Nyingma tradition. And in doing so, Jamgun Mipam then was absolutely brilliant. But his approach, his dialectic approach, you could say, his approach of logic and argumentation and so on and so forth, it employed a unity of 2 approaches. One is what we call pramana, which is epistemology, the knowledge of how we can validly establish truth. And also Madhyamaka, which is, you could say, the vision of such an understanding of truth. So Mipam's approach is known as the intertwined two lions' heads. There's sort of, you imagine 2 lions, and if they were to have very long necks, they could sort of wrap them around. They could see all around in that way. So in that way, this view, if you have these 2 aspects, then your view and your certainty with regards to the view will be complete. So these 2 are mentioned, and specifically what's interesting actually when the Khenpos, they speak about this, then particularly they emphasize how, despite being great masters and all of that, these 2 masters remained very humble and very gentle. Now the main topic today then is the 2 truths, and don't be in any way intimidated by the whole idea of the structure here with its various eras and and sort of era 1, 2, 3 and so on. Look, that's not at all something that we need to be too concerned about. We're really just honing in on the idea of the two truths. And there's Longchen he has some ways of doing this. And he talks about 5 categories. All right, so these are the big headings here. Sorry, the numbers got lost when I created the PowerPoint. But the first one is two truths as objects of valid cognition. If you can get that, then you're fine. Then the purpose of the two truths, the mistaken and valid views, a bit more specific, but then again, it's really just kind of obvious. And then that's number 2. 3 is meaning of the two truths. We'll have a look at that. Completeness, or what we call pervasion of the two truths, meaning how it covers everything. And also, without the two truths, we'd be missing the point. So we talk about the inadequacy if lacking the two truths. So we're just going to go through this. Now, the first category, the object of valid cognition, it really means that as far as the two truths go, let's just see here. It means that when we're talking about the two truths, we're talking about reality. We're talking about what we can see. Now, for example, if we look at table, right? That's a simple one. We can see that, yes, in relative truth, it functions as a table. But can we find anything that is the essence of table? No. We'll just find a lot of parts. So you can say it's a sum of its parts, but these parts in and of themselves don't anywhere contain the essence of table. And we actually have the same with persons. As we know, persons that we know well, they're complex. We are ourselves complex. To find the essence of who we are, difficult. We're continually changing. We're constructs. Now, once we go in and begin to analyze things, then we find out that actually we cannot find anything that what we call withstands analysis. And that means that ultimately the idea of something as solid and ultimately existing doesn't exist. So in that way, that lack of something valid, of something ultimately, that is what we call absolute truth. And that's what enables us to be flexible, tolerant. You know, somebody might do something stupid, but we know that's not the entire truth. They're complex and so on. The moment that we have this perspective, wider perspective that incorporates absolute truth, then also we have more peace of mind. We have wider perspective. We have sense of humor and so on. Relative truth, yes, somebody does something stupid, well, we have to tell them, you know, you're driving too fast in a school zone or whatever. So that makes sense. Yes, that's something that's, you know, not okay. So we do have right and wrong. We do have good and bad and all of that. But what we're looking at is real things. So this is something that is directly cognized. And so we refer to the two truths not as abstract phenomena, but things that we can actually directly perceive, directly cognize. In general, we talk about the objects of valid cognition as falling into 3 categories, which is what is directly cognized, inferentially cognized, and sometimes also cognized through yogic perception. But either way, the two truths are actual objects of valid cognition. That's very important to understand. We're in, you could say, safe grounds. We're not in any kind of hocus pocus or supernatural or metaphysical sort of sphere at all. It's about the real world. It's about real objects, real experience, the immediate. Now, the second category of these two truths then is the purpose of the two truths. And of course, the two truths, they are what enable us to see through deception. That's what we do it. Buddhas are not deceived. Sentient beings are deceived. Sentient beings, they see the appearance of relative truth, but they fail to see that the reality behind it. So they're fooled. They're deceived. Absolute truth, which is what we're honing in on through our path, is the actual reality of these appearances. So we're not fooled. You know, we look at the movie and we know it's just a movie. We see appearances, we don't grasp or fixate. Now, when we look at this, then the purpose then of these two truths is generally that we have, when we are trying to understand this, then sometimes it gets into, it's when we discuss appearances and what's behind the appearances, then there are some things that can crop up in terms of, you could say, sophistry or ways in which we're confused. The two truths, they touch on everything, so don't be surprised that there are some subtle aspects, but then again, this is not incomprehensible. But it is that sometimes in daily ways of talking about going beyond appearances, or also in our own confusion, we often miss the point. So therefore, what we're doing here with these errors and the correct ways of seeing the two truths and so on, is that we're training ourselves to have a clear idea of our reality and what the two truths are. And this is really, really helpful for us so that we're not deceived, not fooled. This is a great exercise. This beats, what's it called, Sudoku or whatever, crosswords. So the first of these is refuting the sameness of the two truths. And there's 4 errors in that. Now, if we were to say, well, there's no difference between how things appear and how they are, well, that's good. That means we would never ever have to ask any questions. We'd never have any debates. They would never ever have. We'd never have anything to talk about when we sit down and have coffees with our friends, because there's nothing to discuss. Everything's evident. Yeah. So, error 1: if the two truths were identical, that means that how things appear and how they are would both be equally true. So you wouldn't need to know any absolute truth. If you know how a person looks, then you also know how they are. That means that everybody would already recognize absolute truth. Everybody would know. But we know that's not the case. We know that you have to actually look beyond appearances. Error 2: if the two truths were identical, there would be the same number of absolute truths as relative truths. Now, the implication here is that there's many different phenomena, and looking beyond each of them, then there would be just as many different absolute truths. And that, of course, the whole point about absolute truth is that it's just the sheer absence of inherent existence. So if there was a car, there would be one particular absolute truth to the appearance of car. If there's Jakob, then there would be another absolute truth as far as that goes. So again, the idea of the appearance and what's behind as identical doesn't hold. 3: if the two truths were identical, there would be no kleshas associated with our dualistic perception. As we know, because that we perceive things, we have likes and dislikes on the basis of our dualistic perceptions, right? Then that brings a lot of, then we have all the destructive emotions and all the actions that are driven by that, the kleshas and the karma. See, so we can see how we are caught up in relative truths phenomena, and as a result we have kleshas. The sage who doesn't get caught up in relative phenomena, who sees absolute phenomena, doesn't have kleshas. So clearly a huge difference in that regard. They are not the same. If the two truths were error 4, if the two truths were identical, there would be no need for the two truths. So that means, again, thus at our, discussing our politicians, discussing politics, discussing philosophy, we'd never have anything to talk about because we'd never question anything. Yeah? If the two truths were identical, if appearance and what's behind were identical, well, there would be no need for talking about what's beyond. There's nothing to talk about. There wouldn't be any questions to be asked. Again, still within the second category, it's all about the classifications. Then now we're talking about the two truths as entirely different. Now, if the two truths were separate, then enlightenment would be partial. That means enlightenment would only know absolute truth, right? It wouldn't understand relative truth. So, in fact, then the Buddha would be useless because he wouldn't be able to talk to anyone. He lives in his own planet and he doesn't understand relative truth, relative perception, and suffering. So we can't say the two truths are separate. If the two truths were separate, then absolute truth would not include relative truth. Well, if absolute truth doesn't include relative truth, what's so great about it? If enlightenment doesn't have to do with the price of eggs, the kitchen sink, and whatever, if it was some rarefied project, then what would be so absolute? What would be ultimate about it? These are important questions. They actually affect what we're doing. Yeah, and there's some of our assumptions. Like people would say, well, these Tibetan sages, it's useless. They're not up to date or whatever. They don't understand reality. Well, if that were the case, then they wouldn't really be sages. Well, the Buddha wouldn't be of much use if the Buddha couldn't actually, if what the Buddha talked about was in a rarefied realm apart from ours. And that's why the Buddha was so compassionate in talking about suffering. It's not like the Buddha was suffering, but he recognized that we are suffering. Error 3. If the two truths were separate, there would be no point in realizing the emptiness of the relative to self, right? We're analyzing. We look in, is there a self? And we are very much onto this relative perception, the relative appearance of what we can call mere self. So when we realize the nature of relative ego, then if the two truths are separate, then that wouldn't have anything to do with absolute truth. If the two truths were separate, perfect realization of absolute truth would not lead to enlightenment. So again, if there were two things, and when we realize absolute truth, now this time we're not talking about relative truth, but if we realize absolute truth, that would have nothing to do with relative truth. And hence, someone who has realized absolute truth would not be omniscient, because the relative truth would still be left untouched. All right? I hope this is okay. If this seems a little bit dense in the logic, well, let me tell you, you can find a lot worse. But also, please go back and revisit. It's just quite useful. That should be. Did I make it here? I might have made that. Sorry, that. Oh, okay. Hold on. Yes. What's the difference between error 1 and error 4 in refuting the sameness of the two truths? Okay. Error 1 and error 4. Let's see here. Refuting this. Oh, error 1 and error 4 in the separateness. Okay. So error 4 was. In the separateness was absolute truth would be in absolute truth omniscience would not know relative truth, right? Okay, let's just see if I can I'm just right. And one was, if the two truths were separate, enlightenment would be partial, relative truth would not be understood. They're very similar. If you were to ask me right now, the first one, the definition is simply that enlightenment would be partial. The last one speaks more about that enlightenment would just be, it wouldn't be omniscience. So you're right, they look very much like the same. There might be some subtlety, and you're you're putting me on the spot here. I should go back and, it's interesting, I should go back and have a look. But for the time being, I think your observation is that they're pretty much the same. One is, I guess, about partiality, and the other one is about omniscience. But yes, good question. You left the teacher a little bit sort of shaky here. Okay, I'm just going on because I can see there's no other questions. Okay, the actual relationship between the two truths. Well, let's just establish that the two truths is something that has to do with the subjective dimension. The knowing or not knowing lies in the subjective, yeah? And so that's why we say it's about valid cognition. So the first thing that we understand is that it has to do with us knowing our reality properly or not. And for that reason, every knowable object, the Tibetan word is shija. For objects, it's interesting. Actually, shija just means that which can be known. And that's what we refer to as the objective dimension. But that which can be known is obviously known through something. And this we also say in science. All objects are known through consciousness, right? There, the two truths apply because they are all about the subjective take on the knowable objects. Now, in that sense, then, the two truths don't exist as something that is, they're neither one nor the same. And this is actually where we have these quotes from various masters. Longchenpa, he then makes the point. The two truths are neither one, as we've seen before, nor the same, as per what we just discussed. They are one nature with two aspects, meaning the object is the same, but there's two ways of seeing things, properly and incorrectly. Yeah? And in fact, when we're talking about the two truths, yes, that's just actually relative truth, because it's what we call a dependent arising. Absolute truth is just a concept that exists on the basis of relative truth and vice versa. So the idea of two truths is a dependent arising. It's not an absolute. So in that sense, it's just labels. And that's also that's what the Prasanghika would say. Oh yeah, all these two truths, it's just concepts. So they would say, in reality, there is no two truths. But for us, yes, there's a big difference between knowing and not knowing what we're perceiving properly. And still, as far as then we're still within these categories, then the purpose of the two truths, then we are talking about, as far as the relative truth goes, we are saying that as far as the valid cognition goes, the reason why we have the two truths is that we can get things right and we can get things wrong. Again, we go back to the subjective, and that is the mind. It's the subjective that can be right or wrong. And that's how we designate then the two truths. Now, if we see clearly, without mistake, that's called an accurate mind, accurate cognition. All right? We see, for example, we talk about if you see a conch. Yeah, if you have jaundice or some condition, you might not see it as white. You'll see it as yellow. So when we talk about accurate mind, accurate cognitions, it's when we don't have jaundice and we see things without any filters of confusion. So as far as then the relative perceptions go, we see things properly or wrongly. Now, as far as seeing the accurate relative truth, right? The undistorted relative truth. Now we're just talking relative truth. This is an important, the Khenpo's go on to say this is a little bit deviating, but this is quite important for us in our path, particularly those who practice Vajrayana. Because when we talk about this accurate relative truth, right? Yeah, then we actually talk about that pure, meaning just ordinary accurate perception. That can then be divided into pure and impure. And that actually means, yes, we're seeing a conscious white, but the way we see it and the way a Buddha will see it is different. And we would say, well, that's just a conch. Well, we actually have the vision of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, which see, yes, that's a white conch, but because they're not caught by this duality, they don't objectify the conch in the same way. They see it more clearly without our overlay of confusion and dualistic obscuration. And that's the foundation for what we call the pramana, or the valid cognition of pure perception. Now, this is very important because sometimes, well, actually in the other traditions, sacred outlook of pure perception is seen as a method. It's a way that you just, for example, you might see the world as a mandala, yourself intrinsically as deity. That's seen as a method. But from the Nyingma point of view, that's actually pramana. That's actually valid cognition. When we say that we're deity, it's not just like a great thought, but it's actually that intrinsically we are deity, and that's what the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas, they see. So whether it's the objective dimension or the subjective dimension, the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas see all of this differently, and that's the foundation for what we then call pure perception. We might not have pure perception, but we can't deny, if we look, that phenomena intrinsically do exist without duality, without obscurations. And as such, when we are applying visualization or sacred outlook, pure perception, whatever we call it, as per Vajrayana sadhana, we're actually not imagining things. We're adopting the more realistic view, the clearer view, the less confused view of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. Again, this has to do with this expanded phenomenology of awakening. And this topic then is a key theme for us to understand Vajrayana. This is discussed in particularly an essential work for the Nyingma tradition called the Guhyagarbha Tantra, and also we find this repeatedly in the writings of Longchen-pa, Jamgyal Mipam, and Rongzom Pandita. If you want to have a really great discussion, see it explained very well, then again I'd recommend Duckworth's Mipam on Buddha nature. So the Nyingma view of pure perception is then particular. The other schools then they see this pure perception as means. They don't actually see it as as pramana, as valid cognition. But we should remember that if we look at an object like a conch, a vase, or whatever, we just see it as an object, plain. But Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, they'll look at the vase, they'll look at even a mote of dust, and they'll see it as countless Buddha fields. They also look at sentient beings, and they see sentient beings as innately pure. Now, pure perception then, as is mentioned then, means that we no longer see the subjective dimension as just an obscured collection, what we call the five skandhas, but rather we see this innately as deity or as the five Buddhas. The objective dimension is seen as the reflection of such, you could say, divine perception or pure outlook or the purity. And so we refer to the five elements as the five mothers or five consorts. The senses, all our sense perceptions are also seen as deity. In this case, we refer to them as 8 bodhisattvas, if we talk about 8 consciousnesses. And also similarly, also the sense objects as the 8 bodhisattvas, the female bodhisattvas. So there's that whole play of subject and object that is seen in its purity then as these mandalas, as the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas. And this is also where we have the whole, you could say, science around the peaceful and wrathful deities. It's simply just taking these teachings that you find everywhere in Buddhism, the 5 skandhas, the consciousnesses, elements, all of that are teachings it's found in the Abhidharma. So it's really just Buddhist phenomenology, Buddhist science on our reality. And in the Vajrayana context, these are just seen as pure perception. So that's what the Guhyagarbha Tantra does, and that's where we have the whole science of the peaceful and wrathful deities. Again, this is where you can sort of despair when you think that people think like the Tibetan Book of the Dead that talks about the peaceful and wrathful deities, that's sort of some sort of, well, as the title says, Tibetan Book of the Dead. It's not at all about that. And so this teaching in the Tibetan title has nothing to do with Tibet or Tibetan beliefs. It's just Buddhism, and it's about introducing this pure perception. Okay. There's also something that then should be known, and this is a little bit an aside, but I just want to throw it in there because this is just something that is particular to Longchen-pa and Jamgyal Mipam, is that they actually talk about an alternative two-truth model, which is authentic and inauthentic experience. See, Buddhas who realized emptiness, they will see, buses, cars, airplanes, people, objects, just as we see, but they'll see them without dualistic clinging, and that we call authentic truth, and that's absolute truth. And inauthentic is when we look at phenomena without realization. That's relative truth. Okay, I'm just throwing that in there. Again, third category, coming back to Longchen-pa, the meaning of the two truths. Again, literally what the two truths mean is then, as you have in the book there, the Sambhiti Satya, which means that it's obscure truth. It's veiled. It's masked. We're looking at a masquerade. We're not seeing reality. That's relative truth. So there's where they quote Longchen-pa, everything we perceive is like a dream. Dream image, illusory. Dream image, illusory. Is like a dream image. It's illusory despite appearing to be real. So basically everything is like a dream. It appears, yet there's nothing about it. It's illusion. That's relative truth. Looks as if it's real, it's not. It's a paper tiger. Absolute truth is then when we see things properly, ultimate, that we are not deceived. So that's what the you could say the etymology or the meaning of the two truths is. Fourth category, again in long-term discussion, pervasion of the two truths. Okay, now whatever we look at, they're included within these two qualifications. So it merely just means that we have, as we saw earlier, this means everything that we have, all the truth values of any phenomena is included within these two models of truth, right? On relative, it means that everything that can be known, objectified, that is dependent arising and so on. And on the other hand, such dependent arising phenomena, they ultimately have no inherent existence. So that means we're covered. If we know the two truths, we've got it down. We've got it down. We know what reality is about. And actually, this is very often the way you could say Western philosophy gets itself a little bit sort of tied up in a knot, because there is not always, in fact, I asked Wilson Fletcher about that, and two truths is not really something that Western philosophy operates with. It's very problematic if you can't distinguish between these two. Otherwise, then what philosophers do is they try to come around with some truth, but leaving out the subjective confusion around what is perceived as some absolute truth leaves actually that philosophy just becomes a very abstract project with little sort of root in our immediate experience. And you also have that. You have great philosophers who have very sophisticated views with regards to our understanding of both philosophy and their own thoughts and so on, but who still are miserable. So the completeness of the two truths is essential, and we should think about that. It's outrageous to think that these two truths cover everything, but it actually do in terms of what really matters. So that as a following, then it also, without the insights of the two truths, then we miss then understanding the relative truth as a dependent arising, the dependent nature of appearing phenomena as relative truth, and also their ultimate lack of reality, which is absolute truth. Okay? Let's see if there's any questions. Now we're just going to go, the last bit here is just about some subcategories. No, there's more than, it's true, there's 6 senses, but we do talk about 8 consciousnesses. So in addition to the 6 senses, we also posit what we call a consciousness of deluded consciousness, afflicted consciousness, and also the alaya. So there, in both of these, we operate with subject and object. So that ends up being 8 consciousnesses. This is standard Yogacarya. How is accurate pure perception different to absolute truth? Well, actually, it needn't be, because if you have, if you understand absolute truth as you could say authentic understanding, then that is absolute. That is an absolute truth, and that's where you then. That's why I put it in there. That is why this understanding of the two truths as authentic and inauthentic experience. So sentient beings have inauthentic experience. Buddhas have authentic experience, and that's why the pure perception, which is the scope of the Buddhas, is essentially pure perception. So how is accurate pure perception different to absolute truth? The former is relative, which by definition is deluded. Yeah. Well, perceptions, yes, you could say relative truth if it's deluded. Yes, that's right. But form, for example, is not by nature deluded. So how can the Buddha's pure perception be in the category of delusion, as per Khenpo's categorization? I don't think so. I don't think there's anywhere it says that the Buddha's pure perception is in a category of delusion. Pure perception, again, does not, it falls into relative truth. But again, as with relative truth, then there's nothing that can be objectified. Yes, you're right. That can be seen as delusion. But for Buddhas, perceptions are not grasped. And so the nature of pure perception is that there's the unity of emptiness and appearance. Keep thinking about this. I'm afraid I'm going to have to take that, what sounds like a facile way of answering a question, but this is a very valid reflection, and this is not something that I know I can probably answer satisfactorily right now. I have attempted, and that's, if you go back over what we've just gone through, the answer to this lies in this authentic and inauthentic two-truth model. But I would also say, like Rinpoche says, stay with that question. Okay. Let's see. We have Janagaba's two truths, and for that, the discussion really more centers on relative truth. Is again coming back to accurate relative truth is the perception without defective senses, and mistaken relative truth is perception with defective senses. The difference lies in valid or invalid perception as a white object with or seen with or without jaundice. So this is fairly straightforward, but it's mentioned because Janagaba was then key to the Svatantrika tradition in that Janagaba was the teacher of Shantarakshita, and he wrote a famous work then that is known as the Two Truths. He wrote a famous work that is called The Two Truths. Yes, and we have an English translation by a professor called Kalupahana. Yeah, so there is an English translation of this. So then we have 4 identifying qualities of relative truth. And again, this is really just that we can see, as far as relative phenomena go, they arise from causes and conditions. Yes. Phenomena, and that means if you have, for example, a rice seed that becomes then you have a rice sprout, it came from the seed, right? So it arises from causes and conditions. But it also goes on to, the rice sprout goes on to become a rice plant. So inevitably, phenomena cause other phenomena to arise. But these phenomena are not random. They arise on the basis of the conditions. So a rice sprout that goes and becomes a rice plant has shared characteristics. It doesn't go ahead and become a rock or a bolt or a pair of shoes or an apple. Rice sprout becomes rice plant, shared characteristics. And then again, phenomena function according to their appearances. Yes, there's, like Tongtse Rinpoche says, relative truth is, we are so caught by worldly logic. So yes, that's the basis of our whole, you could say, modern science. We're just amazed how phenomena functions as they appear. So that's where we don't go beyond appearances. And they work beautifully. We have a whole science of mapping how appearances work, these causes and conditions. What's the ultimate really about these relative phenomena is that they cannot withstand analysis. You go in there and you analyze them, and as much as the people sort of getting funding for the CERN reactor and so much might insist, there's nothing actually that can be ultimately that withstands analysis. Even Higgs boson can be broken down into up and down, left and right, and so on. So there's nothing that exists that is that cannot be, you can say, deconstructed. Nothing withstands analysis. So that's the Svatantrika view about the relative truth. We're going to look at now the absolute truth. And this is important also for us because, and I apologize, I'm going a little bit over time here, because very often when we say emptiness, right, absolute truth, people say, well, we can't know anything about that. And that is so true, but it's also not true, because we can see how, as far as appearances go, let's say we're watching a movie, somebody says, hey, we're sitting there biting our nails and all of that, spilling our popcorn. We're so caught up in the movie, we forget it's in fact just a phenomenon that we're perceiving. And the moment somebody says, hey, look, it's just pixels in front of you, you're just sitting there watching your flat screen or whatever. So in fact that we can actually be introduced to this understanding of absolute truth. We can actually get some idea of what's meant with absolute truth. Think about this intellectual, or what we call countable or categorized absolute truth, where we understand emptiness and we say, it's not really there. Is that thought, emptiness? It's just a thought. It's really just us arriving at, it's not as solid as it seems, or whatever. But we actually don't truly understand what it is. And that's where we need to understand that this is very valid. For us to arrive at understanding of emptiness is essential. It's just thought. And that is essentially also what we call a non-affirmative negation. And we just know that it's it doesn't exist as it appears. There's nothing there. But the uncountable, or the uncategorized absolute truth, is beyond thought. And that's where it goes beyond just, you say, a non-affirmative negation, and also you could say beyond affirmative negation. It's inconceivable. And that's what absolute truth is. And that's where, you can't understand emptiness just from saying, well, it doesn't have an inherent existence. Something needs to be realized. And this then is the difference between, you could say, someone on the path who understands the conceptual or categorized absolute truth, and then a sage who has realized absolute truth. Yeah, that's such uncategorized or uncountable absolute truth is beyond thought. And that's a Svatantrika way of defining the two truths. See, that might be helpful for us, right? Now, that kind of, you could say, reference point, that is what characterizes the Svatantrika approach, that actually gives us some handles. And in terms of talking about these two absolute truths, then as far as the us getting there, then we have, for example, Nagarjuna, who will indicate how the absolute nature is beyond the classifications such as existing, non-existing, both existing, non-existing, or neither existing nor non-existing. These are just sophistry. It's just us trying to label it in one way or another. And reality is beyond that. And this is so beautiful about the Madhyamaka, is that it ultimately shows us existing. That's an extreme. You cannot find anything that truly exists. And you also can't say that it's non-existing. And if you said that, then the two last, they come by themselves. But these are examples of how philosophers, they try to sort of accommodate their rigid labels. And this ultimately brings about a downfall, because when we're clinging on to these labels, we're essentially clinging on to our concepts, and we operate within rigidity, and we don't see the nature of reality, which is beyond these kind of labels. So Shantarakshita then says, countable or categorized absolute truth is very close to the reality of absolute truth. So practitioners can use it to reliably progress along the path. For this reasons, we teachers name it countable absolute truth. Yeah? So that's how we understand countable or categorized absolute truth. Now, the uncountable absolute truths, that's beyond, and that's what's shared by Prasangika and Svatantrika alike. So somebody will ask, Sanskrit Rinpoche has been teaching Prasangika. Yes, because we need to actually have that, you could say, understanding that ultimately there's nothing that we can objectify. So that's where the Prasangika is very important actually to understand, but then again, Svatantrika can be very helpful in terms of the path. So when we then on the path, or in general establishing an understanding, then this is the Svatantrikas that do this to accommodate that kind of understanding or analysis that we use when we think about things. And that's clearly not in meditation. In meditation, we just leave mind without following after thoughts. We stick to the meditation, whatever we're doing. But the post-meditation is where we analyze. Okay. Can you give another example for 3? Was that back in the department of the same? Let me just see, same, hold on. Third category, meaning of the two truths. Slide 28. Okay, let me just get back there. Thank you for your questions. Okay, we're going to go a little bit over time, but I'm really happy when you are asking questions. Okay, let's go back to 28. Hold on. Slide 28. Slide 28. The four identifying qualities of relative truth. Okay. Phenomena function according to their appearances. Yes. That really refers to the fact that phenomena just function. So you could say a table. That's a relative phenomena, right? But it functions. It looks like a table and it works like a table. So in that way, the way it functions is in concordance with the appearance. You know, horses run, tables accommodate stuff, and so on. Yeah. Let's just see if did that answer your question? Okay. And then someone observes that for some the non-affirming negation becomes a kind of affirmation. Yes, that's true. When we say there is a no, then that becomes yes. It becomes a rigid position, doesn't it? So that's why Mivaramaja ultimately is all about sort of getting rid of the whole, you could say some of the ideas around what this implies. But we should be careful because these terms, non-affirming negation, it's very useful. You know, like for example, imagine you have a nightmare and then you realize it was just a nightmare. You wake up. The mere fact that you could arrive at this non-affirming negation, it liberates you. No? Or if you're sort of wondering if there's a thief downstairs and you sort of go down, switch on the light, you expect to get shot, but then there's no thief, it's just a cat. Then that non-affirming negation, yeah, it becomes an affirmation, but it's also more than that. It's liberation. So from that point of view, the non-affirming negation is not all that bad. But again, it's a problem if it becomes a rigid position. Okay. I guess that's it. Thanks again, guys, and we'll dedicate the merit. Next time, please read then up until page 91, where we're going to be going through the understanding of the Vajrayana. By this merit may all attain omniscience, may defeat the enemy wrongdoing, from the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness and death, from the ocean of samsara, may all beings be freed. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen, may it never fail, but grow and increase ever more and more. Thank you.